There's a certain type of person who becomes convinced that enough money can change the facts. And believe me, the woman leading our HOA had perfected that belief. My name is Ethan Walker, and I own a peaceful 5-acre horse property that had been in my family for almost 3 decades. It wasn't some extravagant ranch, but it was home. The property included a professionally constructed riding arena where I spent every week training rescue horses. Everything shifted the day a luxury wedding venue opened nearby, and the HOA president suddenly decided that my completely legal riding arena was an ugly problem that needed to vanish before an important event took place. At first, I assumed it was just another unreasonable complaint that would eventually fade away. Instead, the situation exploded into threats, official notices, surprise inspections, and one of the most outrageous displays of entitlement I had ever encountered. When I finally uncovered the real reason behind their sudden fixation on my property, I could hardly believe it. And in the end, the very scheme they created ended up wrecking the event they were so determined to protect. The entire mess began roughly 6 months before everything came crashing down. Up until then, life on my property had been pleasantly predictable. My days started before dawn, feeding horses, inspecting fences, smoothing the riding arena, and working with rescue animals that required patience far more than perfection. The arena itself wasn't some massive commercial business. It was a professionally graded sand arena with secure fencing, proper drainage, and enough space for a handful of training sessions each week during the evenings. The permits had been approved years before I ever lived there full-time, and county records clearly showed the arena existed long before the HOA boundaries were expanded. That detail matters more than you might think, because later on, it completely dismantled everything they attempted to do. Looking back now, it's almost amusing that a perfectly legal horse arena somehow became the neighborhood's biggest enemy. At the time, though, there was nothing funny about it. It felt like someone had placed a giant target directly on my property. Things started changing when an old estate about half a mile away was purchased by investors and transformed into a high-end wedding and corporate event venue. Practically overnight, expensive landscaping appeared. Elegant lighting systems were installed. Polished advertisements flooded social media. Soon, luxury SUVs were traveling down our rural roads every weekend. Most of us didn't really care. More business meant more work for local contractors, vendors, and restaurants. Yes, traffic increased slightly, but it was manageable. I honestly assumed everyone would simply learn to coexist. That's usually how rural communities function. People understand they're moving into farmland and open country, not a perfectly controlled suburban movie set. Apparently, the venue's new owners saw things differently. They wanted every road leading to their property to look flawless because brides, photographers, influencers, and wealthy clients would be driving through the area. That's where my horse arena suddenly became an issue. From one small section of road, drivers could briefly see part of the riding ring and its fencing beyond a row of trees. It wasn't unattractive. If anything, most people felt the horses added character to the countryside. Visitors often slowed their vehicles just to watch them grazing in the fields. Children loved waving as they drove by. During all the years I had lived there, not a single neighbor had ever complained. Then the HOA election happened. Our previous HOA president had been practical and level-headed. He focused on maintaining the shared roads, balancing budgets, and avoiding unnecessary conflict. When he stepped down, a woman named Victoria Langford was elected to replace him. From the very beginning, she behaved less like a volunteer board member and more like the ruler of her own private empire. New newsletters began appearing almost every week. Fresh regulations seemed to materialize out of nowhere. Committees were created to address issues nobody had ever considered problems before. Suddenly, residents were receiving warning letters about mailbox colors, landscaping decisions, park trailers, fence styles, and decorative lighting. I've seen people abuse a little authority before, but this was something else entirely. You could practically sense the tension every time neighbors opened their mailboxes, wondering what violation notice might be waiting inside. At first, I paid very little attention to it. My property was well maintained, my taxes were current, my permits were valid, and my horses were properly cared for. I always believed that people who followed the rules generally had nothing to fear. That belief didn't survive very long. One afternoon, I pulled into my driveway, and found a bright orange notice attached to my front gate. According to the letter, my riding arena was supposedly in violation of newly adopted community appearance standards. The notice claimed that the fencing, arena surface, and related equipment negatively affected the visual appeal of the neighborhood. It instructed me to submit plans to remove the arena within 30 days. Not improve it, not modify it, remove it entirely. I read the notice 3 separate times because I honestly thought it had to be some kind of joke. The arena had been completely legal for years. The HOA had previously approved property disclosures that acknowledged its existence. County permits were properly recorded. Historical aerial photographs clearly showed the arena sitting in the same location it had occupied for years. None of it added up. More curious than angry, I attended the next HOA meeting, expecting the matter to be resolved in a few minutes. Instead, Victoria arrived with a projector presentation. She displayed polished photographs of my property on a large screen, zooming in on sections of fencing and the riding surface, as if she were presenting evidence of major environmental catastrophe. She spent several minutes discussing property values, luxury community branding, visual standards, and the importance of maintaining a consistent appearance throughout the neighborhood. But while she was speaking, I noticed something odd. Every single photograph had been taken from the exact same roadside location. It was the only spot where visitors driving toward the new wedding venue could briefly see my arena. That was when everything started falling into place. Nobody complained when tractors sat outside neighboring properties. Nobody objected to hay fields, livestock enclosures, barns, or agricultural equipment. Yet somehow my horse arena had suddenly become a threat to the neighborhood's image. This wasn't really about community standards. It was about protecting the appearance of someone else's business. I left that meeting with far more questions than answers, but one thing was absolutely clear. This was not a simple misunderstanding that would disappear after a conversation. Someone wanted my arena removed, and they intended to use the HOA as the weapon. At that point, I still had no idea how far they were willing to push things, or how dramatically their plan would eventually collapse. The moment I realized this was more than an overly aggressive HOA complaint, I stopped treating it like a minor inconvenience and began documenting everything. Every letter, every email, every inspection notice, every photograph attached to violation forms. All of it went into a thick binder that steadily grew larger on my desk. There was something about Victoria's sudden determination that felt far too organized to be accidental. That's often how people behave when they believe nobody will challenge them. They push a little farther each time, assuming everyone will eventually give in before recognizing the pattern. I had no intention of being one of those people. The pressure increased almost immediately. Within 2 weeks, 3 separate violation notices arrived, each citing completely different sections of the HOA handbook. One claimed the arena fencing disrupted the community's visual uniformity. Another suddenly argued that my equipment trailer was being stored improperly, despite sitting in the exact same location for years without generating a single complaint. Then they accused me of creating excessive dust through increased horse activity, even though I routinely watered and maintained the arena according to county requirements. Every time I answered one complaint with records and documentation, another accusation seemed to appear out of nowhere. It felt less like legitimate enforcement and more like someone frantically throwing darts at a target, hoping one would finally hit something. By that point, I could hardly believe how obvious the whole thing had become. Their strategy had become painfully obvious. They weren't actually trying to prove that I had broken any rules. Their goal was to make defending myself so frustrating and time-consuming that I would eventually surrender and tear down the arena, simply to end the constant pressure. The problem for them was that I'm naturally stubborn. And if there's one thing years of working with rescue horses teaches you, it's patience. The kind of patience most people underestimate until they run into it themselves. Then I discovered the missing piece of the puzzle. One neighbor quietly mentioned that the luxury venue had started promoting panoramic countryside, wedding photographs taken from the same road that overlooked my property. Suddenly, everything clicked. Prospective brides touring the venue drove directly past my arena on their way to this state. Somewhere along the line, someone had decided that horses, fencing, and training equipment didn't fit the polished image they wanted to market. My property wasn't violating community standards. It was interfering with someone else's advertising strategy. That realization completely changed the way I viewed the conflict. I was no longer just protecting my land. I was standing between a lucrative business opportunity and a group of people who believed they could pressure a homeowner into solving their branding problem at no cost to themselves. They thought they controlled all the leverage. What they didn't realize was that I had finally uncovered the motive that would eventually unravel their entire operation. The turning point arrived much sooner than anyone expected. About 3 weeks before the venue's largest luxury wedding of the year, I received what Victoria clearly believed would be the final blow. A certified letter arrived demanding that I begin removing the arena immediately or face escalating daily HOA fines. Instead of arguing, I quietly gathered my records and forwarded everything to an attorney. Every permit, every county document, every violation notice, every piece of correspondence I had carefully collected. Within days, the HOA received a formal legal response explaining that my arena was legally grandfathered, had existed prior to the HOA boundary expansion, and was completely outside the authority they were attempting to exercise. The letter went even further. It warned that continuing their pattern of selective enforcement could expose the HOA to significant legal liability. What happened next honestly surprised even me. The HOA called an emergency board meeting, and several board members who had never been given the full picture suddenly realized that Victoria had been pursuing personal interests connected to the nearby event venue rather than enforcing legitimate community regulations. Faced with the possibility of lawsuits and growing backlash from within their own organization, the board acted quickly. Every violation issued against me was withdrawn, every single one. And that's when the situation took an even more ironic turn. Without the guaranteed perfect countryside view they had apparently been promising, the luxury venue lost a major client who had expected exactly the image being advertised. The cancellation cost them one of their highest profile events of a year. The campaign designed to eliminate my arena ended up costing them far more than simply leaving my horses alone ever would have. Once the violations were officially removed, life gradually returned to normal. The arena remained exactly where it had always been. My routine with the rescue horses continued uninterrupted. The daily feeding, training sessions, fence checks, and long hours of patient work all carried on as before. A few months later, Victoria quietly resigned from the HOA board. New leadership stepped in and focused on genuine neighborhood concerns instead of personal agendas and power plays. As for the luxury venue, they eventually adapted their marketing strategy rather than attempting to reshape the surrounding community to fit their advertisements. Looking back now, I realized that the biggest victory wasn't proving that I was right. The real victory was refusing to be intimidated into surrendering something that had always belonged to me legally. Sometimes the strongest response isn't retaliation. Sometimes it's simply standing your ground. This entire experience reminded me that entitlement often collapses when it finally collides with documented facts. It's honestly amazing how far some people will go when they mistake authority for absolute control. Karma doesn't always show up immediately, but when it finally arrives, its timing can be remarkably precise. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, subscribe, and share for more unbelievable HOA drama, outrageous power trips, and satisfying real-life comebacks.